Let's dive into a story that takes place at the dawn of the 5th century. Now, when we think of Rome at this time, we usually picture the Western Empire, crumbling and falling apart. But that's not where we're going. We're heading to the east, to Constantinople, a city of staggering wealth and power, the envy of the entire world. But underneath all that gold, the historian Edward Gibbon saw something else, a system in a state of premature and perpetual decay. And right at the center of it is a wild story of corruption, ambition, and what happens when the man on the throne is nothing more than a ghost. I mean, just try to picture the scene. The emperor's robes were pure silk, covered in golden dragons. His throne, solid gold. When he went out, his chariot was drawn by perfectly white mules, surrounded by purple curtains and shining gold plates. It was pure spectacle. But here's the kicker. You had powerful voices like St. John Chrysostom who would get up and preach about this, and he'd praise the magnificence, sure, but in the same breath, he'd condemn it as just hollow, empty pomp. He saw the glitter, and he saw the rot underneath. And this really gets to the heart of the whole problem. On paper, the Emperor Arcadius was everything. He was the successor to Augustus and Caesar, the ruler of the world. But in reality, the man himself was, well, a nobody. Gibbon calls him weak, passive. Get this, in a 13-year reign, not a single decision, not one action could actually be called his own. Think about that. He was just a figurehead, a living statue. The throne was effectively empty. So that's the big question, isn't it? When the person who's supposed to have absolute power is completely incapable of using it, who steps in? Power hates a vacuum. Someone is always going to rush in to fill that void. And in Constantinople, the person who did just that, well, his story is one of the most unbelievable in all of Roman history. All right, let's meet our main character, Eutropius. He was a eunuch in the imperial palace, and he's the one who grabbed the reins of power right out of Arcadius's weak hands. Now, to understand just how absolutely radical, how earth-shattering this was, you first have to understand what a eunuch's job was supposed to be. So, traditionally, eunuchs were background players. They were servants, wardrobe attendants, chamberlains. Now, don't get me wrong, they could be incredibly influential. They had the emperor's ear, they could whisper a suggestion here, start a nasty rumor there, and totally ruin a general's career. But their power was always secret. It was always behind the scenes. They never, ever stepped into the spotlight. Eutropius, though, he wasn't interested in whispering. He didn't just step out of the shadows, he kicked the door down, strode onto the public stage, and started taking on roles that no one of his kind had ever dared to before. He just shattered every single Roman tradition. He put on the robes of a magistrate and sat as a judge. He put on armor and led the Roman army on horseback, which was so bizarre that Rome's enemies, the Goths, joked that they hoped Rome would always send a eunuch to fight them. He was even named patrician, basically father of the emperor. And then came the final, ultimate insult. To Roman dignity, Eutropius, a eunuch and a former slave, was named consul of Rome. That was an honor so sacred, the Romans of the day just couldn't believe. So, you've got all this unprecedented power. What do you do with it? Do you reform the government? Make the empire stronger? Nope. Eutropius put the Roman Empire up for sale. His greed was absolutely endless, and his time in charge became all about one thing: corruption on a scale nobody had ever seen. And people at the time were not quiet about it. The poet Claudian called him an infamous broker of the empire. And that last line there is just vicious. As he has been sold himself, he is desirous of selling the rest of mankind. It was common knowledge that Eutropius started life as a slave who'd been bought and sold many times, and Claudian is saying, now it's his turn, you do the selling. And this wasn't some shady back alley dealing. He was brazen about it. We're told he had a huge tablet set up in his waiting room that was literally a price list for high-ranking government jobs. You want to be the governor of Asia? Okay, that'll cost you a country estate. The governorship of Syria? Apparently, one guy paid for it with his wife's jewelry. The fate of millions of people was being auctioned off to the highest bidder. Okay, so obviously when you're this corrupt, people hate you. Eutropius knew he was sitting on a powder keg. And what's his solution? He doesn't change his ways, of course not. He changes the law.
In 397, he basically weaponized the concept of treason to protect himself and his crony.
His system was built on what you could call 3 pillars of tyranny. First, he made the target bigger. It wasn't just treason to plot against the emperor anymore. Now plotting against any of Eutropius's friends was treason too. Second, and this is genuinely chilling, he criminalized thought. The law literally said that having a mischievous intention, even if you never said it out loud, was a crime. And if you knew someone else was having that thought and you kept quiet, you were guilty too. Third, the punishment didn't stop with you. Oh no. Your sons would lose everything, their inheritance, their status, and be branded with shame for the rest of their lives.
But here's the thing about a reign of terror. It can't last. The more you squeeze, the more enemies you make. And eventually, those enemies start talking to each other. A conspiracy was brewing. A coalition of powerful people who all wanted one thing: Eutropius gone. So let's meet the key players. You had a Gothic general named Tribigild who was leading a revolt out in the provinces. Then you had another general, Gainas, who was sent to stop the revolt, but secretly he was helping it along, hoping it would bring Eutropius down. Classic double-cross. But the final nail in the coffin came from inside the palace. The Empress Eudocia ran crying to her husband, the emperor, claiming Eutropius had insulted her. And for the puppet emperor, that was the final straw.
And when his power crumbled, it crumbled fast. All in the year 399. The rebellion created the chaos. General Gainas made his move and demanded Eutropius's head as the price for peace. The empress gave the final push. And the moment Arcadius signed the order, Gibbon says, the magic spell was instantly dissolved. All at once, the most powerful man in the empire was a fugitive, running for his life and hiding in a church. He was exiled for a bit, but his enemies weren't satisfied. They brought him back and had him executed.
So now we get to the end, and the final moments of his life are really what turned his story into a timeless cautionary tale, what Gibbon calls a solemn and instructive spectacle.
I mean, you have to just paint this picture in your mind. Eutropius, the man who sold off provinces and commanded armies, is now described as a pale and affrighted wretch, literally groveling under the altar in the great cathedral, and standing over him is the Archbishop John Chrysostom, a man Eutropius himself had put in power, preaching to this huge crowd about how unstable human greatness is, while using the terrified man at his feet as Exhibit A. The irony is just staggering. And here is the final, absolutely absurd twist. After all of that, the terror, the corruption, the selling of the empire, what was the official crime they finally pinned on him to justify his execution? Was it any of those things? Nope. He was found guilty of using the wrong color mules for his chariot, a color that was reserved only for the emperor. I'm not making that up. It's just a perfect, staggering example of how tyranny works. The decision to destroy him was already made. The crime was just a ridiculous excuse. So, the tyrant is gone. Problem solved, right? Happy ending? Not a chance. His main co-conspirator, General Gainas, immediately tried to seize power for himself, which led to even more bloodshed. Getting rid of one corrupt man didn't fix the broken system. It just opened the door for the next one. The cycle just continued. And that really leaves us with the big takeaway here. This isn't just a story about ancient Rome. It's a timeless question about power itself. It makes you ask, when power stops being a duty you have to earn and instead becomes just a prize that's up for grabs, can that cycle of corruption and ambition ever really be broken?
You know, when we think about how great empires fall, we usually picture massive armies at the gates or total economic collapse. But sometimes it's not that grand. Sometimes the fatal blow comes from something much more human. Pride, paranoia, a personal grudge. This is one of those stories about how the rivalry between two men didn't just end their lives, it cost the Roman Empire one of its most vital provinces. This isn't just history, folks, it's a tragedy of human error with consequences on an epic scale.
The historian Edward Gibbon really just put it perfectly. The whole catastrophe, the entire loss of a continent, hinged on two men who absolutely should have been allies. If they'd worked together, their combined strength might have been the shield a dying Rome desperately needed. Instead, their conflict became the sword that just hacked off one of its most important limbs. So, who were these guys? and what on earth drove them to such a disastrous end?
All right, so let's set the scene. We're in the early 5th century, and the Western Roman Empire is, to put it mildly, a mess. The throne is weak, the borders are constantly getting hammered, and the imperial court is basically a snake pit of intrigue. This is the world that Empress Placidia is trying to navigate. So, her brother, Emperor Honorius, dies, and there's a power vacuum. Immediately, a court official, a guy named John, makes a grab for power. Placidia, with some help from the Eastern Empire, manages to crush his rebellion and put her own 6-year-old son on the throne. But here's the catch. Now she's a woman ruling in a man's world, a regent for a little kid just desperately trying to hold a crumbling empire together. Her survival? It depended entirely on the loyalty of powerful and very ambitious generals.
And amidst all this decay, the empire's military might really came down to 2 men. Gibbon calls them the last of the Romans, Aetius and Boniface. Think of them as the 2 pillars meant to hold up the entire sky. But a fatal crack was about to form right between them.
And these 2 guys, well, they could not have been more different. Aetius was the ultimate political insider. He was right there at court, a master of whispers and flattery, and had even backed a usurper in the past. Boniface, on the other hand, was the loyal soldier, stationed way out on the frontier. As the governor of Africa, he was famous for his absolute integrity and his brutal, swift justice. He was a commander, not a courtier, a man of principle, not a political schemer.
So, Aetius, being right there at court, had the upper hand. He saw his rival, Boniface, not as a fellow Roman who could help save the empire, but just as an obstacle to his own ambition. So he cooks up this brilliant and absolutely destructive plot to get rid of him without ever having to lift a finger himself.
The plan was just devastatingly simple. Aetius played both sides against each other. First, he goes to the empress and secretly warns her, hey, Boniface is planning a rebellion. Then he turns around and sends a secret letter to Boniface saying, watch out, the empress is planning to kill you. She's going to recall you to Rome, but it's a trap. So what happens? Placidia, now suspicious, officially recalls Boniface. And Boniface, terrified for his life, refuses to go. For the empress, that refusal was all the proof she needed. Aetius had turned a loyal general into a rebel using nothing but a lie.
So just like that, Boniface is declared an enemy of the state. He's totally trapped. I mean, he was a great general, sure, but he knew his local troops in Africa stood no chance against the full might of the Roman legions, especially if they were led by his rival, Aetius. Cornered and desperate, he made one of the most disastrous decisions in all of Roman history.
He invited the Vandals to come into Africa. This was a Germanic tribe that had set up shop in Spain, and they were led by King Genseric, a military genius described as having a limp and a slow way of speaking, but whose ambition was absolutely boundless. Boniface thought he was just hiring some mercenaries to help him out. What he was really doing was unlocking the front door for a conqueror.
Now that number, 50,000 warriors, it might not sound massive by ancient standards. But you have to understand this wasn't just a mob. This was a unified, battle-hardened army. And they weren't just looking for a quick payday. They were looking for a new home, and they saw one in the incredibly rich, fertile lands of Roman Africa.
The moment Genseric and his Vandals set foot in Africa, any illusion of control that Boniface might have had just evaporated. Instantly. The alliance became an invasion, and the province, the literal breadbasket of the Roman Empire, began to burn.
So you have to be wondering, how did 50,000 invaders just roll over 7 huge provinces so quickly? Well, the truth is, Genseric walked into a land that was already divided against itself. He didn't just bring an army, he brought a spark to a tinderbox that was ready to explode. See, Genseric was smart. He expertly exploited all these internal conflicts. He found allies in the native Moors who were sick of their Roman rulers. And he also found allies in the Donatists, a Christian group that was being heavily persecuted by the mainstream Catholic state. To these people, Genseric wasn't some barbarian invader. He was a liberator. Rome's own subjects became the Vandals' greatest weapon.
And right in the middle of all this fire and chaos, the truth finally comes out. An envoy from the Empress meets with Boniface. They compare the letters they received, and Aetius's two-faced treachery is laid bare. Can you imagine that moment? Boniface was horrified. He immediately pledges his loyalty back to Rome, but it was just too late. Genseric had tasted his prize, and he had zero intention of leaving. The fire that Boniface started was now a raging inferno he couldn't possibly put out.
The Vandals are just sweeping across the country, and they lay siege to the city of Hippo. Now this is where one of the greatest minds of the Western world, St. Augustine, was living. He actually died during the siege, forced to watch the total collapse of his country from behind the city walls. His incredible library was saved, but his city and his country were lost. It's just such a powerful symbol of the human and cultural cost of this whole disaster.
So, even with the truth revealed, the Vandal momentum was completely unstoppable. Boniface was defeated in one last desperate battle and had to flee back to Italy, abandoning Africa to its fate. And the stage was now set for the final act of this tragedy, both for the province and for the two rivals who started it all.
Back in Italy, that private feud finally came to a head. Aetius and Boniface met on the battlefield to settle things once and for all. And here's the crazy part. Boniface actually won the battle, but he took a mortal spear wound from Aetius himself and died just a few days later. In a final, bizarre twist of fate, his dying wish was for his wealthy wife to marry his rival, Aetius. So, at the exact moment of its greatest crisis, Rome was suddenly deprived of its two best generals. And with Rome's best generals now out of the picture, Genseric played his final card. He used a peace treaty as a smokescreen, launched a surprise attack, and captured Carthage. The blow was catastrophic. This wasn't just any city. This was Carthage, the second city of the West, the granary that fed the empire. Its loss sent absolute shockwaves across the entire Mediterranean world.
Genseric moved fast. He immediately began to build his new kingdom. He stripped the province of all its gold and silver. He divided up the best, richest lands among his Vandal warriors. He kicked out the Roman nobility and senators. And just like that, a flourishing Roman province was transformed into an independent and very hostile Vandal kingdom right on Rome's doorstep.
So, it all comes down to this. The fall of Roman Africa was a conquest made possible not really by an invincible army, but by a single, vicious lie. It's just a stark, chilling reminder of how the personal failings of people in power, their paranoia, their ambition, their inability to get along, can unleash forces that bring an entire empire to its knees. It proves that sometimes a private quarrel can end in the loss of a continent.
All right, let's dive into one of the most chaotic moments in all of history, the fall of the Roman Empire. But we're not going to talk about the slow internal decay today. Nope. We are focusing on the man who was like a human battering ram at the gates of Rome, a guy who became a walking, talking legend. Attila the Hun. To really get what Attila did, you have to picture the world he stepped into. This was not the mighty, stable Roman Empire you see in the movies. The historian Edward Gibbon put it perfectly. He said the world was already being crushed by the Goths and the Vandals. Those were the names that gave Roman kids nightmares, the constant threat hacking away at the edges of their world.
But here's the thing the Romans didn't quite grasp. The Goths and Vandals, they were running from something worse. Way out on the endless plains of Scythia, a new storm was gathering, a force so powerful it was going to make all those other enemies look like a joke. The Huns were on the move.
And leading them was the man who would finally unite their tribes and earn himself that terrifying nickname, the Scourge of God. This is the story of how he pulled it off.
So, what did this guy actually look like? Well, lucky for us, a Gothic historian got a good look at him and wrote it all down. And let me tell you, he wasn't some chiseled Roman statue. He had a huge head, a flat nose, and this short, powerful, almost square body. But it's his attitude that really stands out. He had this arrogant walk, and he'd roll his eyes around as if he wished to enjoy the terror which he inspired. The guy literally weaponized his appearance.
But Attila's power wasn't just about being a scary-looking dude. He was a master of propaganda, a genius at building his own myth. He knew that to really lead, fear wasn't enough. People had to believe he was destined to rule. And that brings us to the incredible legend of the Sword of Mars.
It's a question as old as time, isn't it? How do you go from being just a man, a leader, to something divine in the eyes of your people? For Attila, the answer was a simple but absolutely brilliant piece of marketing.
So this story starts spreading like wildfire among the Huns. It goes like this. A simple shepherd sees that one of his cows is bleeding. He follows the trail of blood, and it leads him to the tip of an ancient sword just sticking out of the ground. Now, this wasn't just any old sword. It was believed to be the sacred sword of the Scythian god of war. And who does the shepherd give it to? You guessed it, Attila.
Now here's the crucial part. Did this actually happen? Who knows? It doesn't even matter. By taking that sword, this Sword of Mars, Attila was making a statement.
He was saying, I am the chosen one. I am the instrument of a god. Suddenly, his wars weren't just about loot anymore. They were a holy mission. His claim to rule the whole world was now, in his people's eyes, totally legit. Okay, so a divine mandate is powerful stuff. But Attila built his empire on something a lot more practical: extortion. He basically perfected the art of bullying an entire empire, the rich Eastern Roman Empire, with psychological and economic warfare.
This one little anecdote tells you everything you need to know about who was in charge. Roman ambassadors show up to negotiate, thinking they'll meet as equals. But Attila and his top guys, they don't even bother to get off their horses. They literally look down on the Romans, dictating the treaty from above. It was a calculated, brutal power play from the very first second.
And those terms were just savage. The protection money Rome paid to keep the Huns away started at 350 pounds of gold a year. The minute Attila took charge, he doubled it, 700 pounds. Then, after a quick and bloody war, he jacked it up to 2,100 pounds of gold every single year. He was basically turning the Roman Empire into his personal ATM.
And if that wasn't bad enough, on top of that crippling yearly payment, he demanded a one-time fee of 6,000 pounds of gold, just to make up for the trouble of the war. The Eastern Roman treasury was so completely broke that the emperor had to force his senators to sell off their family jewelry, their fancy furniture, anything they could, just to pay off the barbarian breathing down their necks.
So it's really easy to just write Attila off as some savage thug. But we have this incredible, rare eyewitness account from a Roman ambassador who went to a feast in Attila's camp, and what he saw gives us a much more complicated picture of the man.
The whole scene was just wild. The Roman guests and other Hunnic chiefs are all eating these fancy meals off of silver and gold plates, getting drunk. Meanwhile, Attila himself is just eating some plain meat from a wooden plate and drinking from a wooden cup. In the middle of all this incredible wealth that he'd conquered, he lived like a Spartan. While everyone else was laughing and partying, he just sat there, totally serious, with this intense gravity about him.
But maybe the most shocking thing that happened on that visit was a conversation the Roman ambassador had. He ran into a guy who used to be a Roman citizen, now dressed up like a rich Hun. He'd been captured years ago. And this guy tells the ambassador straight up that getting captured was the best thing that ever happened to him.
And why? Well, his reasons are just this devastating critique of the Roman Empire. He said the government couldn't protect its own people, but it also made it illegal for them to own weapons to protect themselves. The taxes were insane and collected by corrupt officials. And justice? Ha ha ha! Justice was only for the rich. He argued that life with the so-called barbarians was actually freer and safer than life in the so-called civilized Roman world.
This encounter just peels back the curtain on how rotten the empire had become. And when you're that rotten, and you're faced with a guy like Attila, you start using the tools of the weak. And that brings us to the climax of our story, the plot to assassinate the king of the Huns.
So, the Romans can't beat Attila in battle, and they can't afford to pay him off anymore, so the emperor's right-hand man, a minister named Chrysostom, comes up with a new plan. He secretly meets with one of Attila's own messengers and offers him a mountain of gold to murder his own king. And the Roman emperor himself, he signed off on it.
But the whole thing blew up in their faces. The Hunnic messenger went straight back to Attila and told him everything. So now Attila has the Roman ambassadors, including the guy who was supposed to arrange the hit, totally at his mercy. And what does he do? He lets them go. The barbarian king had more honor than the so-called civilized emperor.
Attila didn't need a sword for his revenge. His words were sharper. He sent his own guys back to the emperor's court with the bag of assassination gold. They walked right into the throne room and delivered this epic smackdown. He basically called the emperor a pathetic slave who was trying to kill his master, the master being, of course, Attila himself. It was a humiliation more total than any battlefield loss. The Emperor Theodosius was just shamed, left trembling in his own court. His corrupt minister, Chrysostom, was eventually put to death. In that one moment, without even a single fight, Attila proved his absolute dominance. He hadn't just broken the Roman army.
He had broken the Roman emperor's spirit.
And Theodosius didn't have to live with that shame for very long. Just 2 years later, he died after falling off his horse. A new, tougher emperor named Marcian came to the throne, and he promised to get Rome's dignity back.
But that leaves us with the big question, doesn't it? Sure, Rome had a new leader, but Attila had done more than just win some wars. He had held up a giant mirror to the empire, and what it showed was ugly. It showed weakness, corruption, and a system that was failing its own people. So the question is, after being so completely broken, not just financially but psychologically, could the empire ever really be saved?
All right, we're diving into one of history's most dramatic turning points. I'm talking about the chaotic final years of the Western Roman Empire. And really, it's a story that's all about 3 unforgettable figures. You've got a terrified emperor, a king who wants to conquer the world, and the one single general standing between them.
So on one side, you have the Roman Emperor Valentinian III. Let's be honest, he's kind of a feeble ruler of this crumbling empire, far more interested in the luxuries of his palace than the, massive dangers gathering on his borders. And on the other side, Attila the Hun, the scourge of God. His name alone was enough to inspire terror, and his ambition was, well, nothing less than conquering the entire known world. Now, listen to this. This wasn't some polite request. It was a demand, and he sent it to both the Eastern and Western emperors. I mean, can you imagine the sheer audacity? Attila doesn't see them as his equals at all. He basically sees them as groundskeepers who need to get his new property ready. He pretty quickly decides the Eastern Empire can wait and turns his full, terrifying attention to the West. So, a conqueror like Attila, he doesn't just invade. He needs a reason, a justification, a pretext. And as it turns out, he had 2. One was a pretty standard power dispute. Business as usual. But the other one, the other was a shocking scandal that came from deep inside the imperial palace itself. Okay, so let's meet Justa Grata Honoria. She's the Emperor Valentinian's sister. Now, she was raised to a life of imperial greatness, sure, but she was also condemned to a life of forced celibacy. Why? Well, her marriage was just seen as too big of a political risk, and by her teens, she had absolutely had enough of her gilded cage. So, in an act of just incredible desperation, or maybe it was pure revenge, she makes her move. A huge one. She gives her own ring to a loyal servant, who then carries it straight into the camp of the Huns. The message here is unmistakable. Come and claim me. She's begging him to make her his wife, and with her, of course, would come a claim to the Roman Empire. A Roman princess offering herself to the very man her people considered a barbarian monster. Just wow.
At first, it seems like Attila just kind of brushed the offer aside. But when it suited his ambitions later on, he masterfully dusted it off. He took Honoria's proposal and coupled it with a totally separate dispute over who should be king of the Franks. And there you have it. He now had his justification. He wasn't just marching into Gaul as a conqueror. Oh no, he was marching in as the champion of a wronged princess and a rightful Frankish heir. See how clever that is? So, with Attila's horde just pouring into Gaul, burning entire cities like Metz to the ground, the Western Empire had only one person who could possibly stand against him. A general whose name would go down in history, Flavius Aetius. Even his enemies, people like the Goths, they recognized his greatness. This quote isn't just flattery. It's a testament from someone who was there, who saw Aetius as the literal savior of Roman civilization. He was the only thing holding the whole crumbling mess together.
But how did Aetius get so good at fighting these so-called barbarians? Well, the answer is pretty simple. He lived with them. As a political hostage in his youth, he learned the ways of the Goths, and, this is the crucial part, the Huns. He spoke their language, he learned their tactics, he even struck up a personal friendship with the young Attila. This completely unique upbringing gave him an understanding of Rome's friends and its foes that nobody else had. Okay, so this all builds to a huge, decisive moment. Attila is laying siege to the city of Orleans, which is basically the strategic key to the heart of Gaul. Aetius knows this is it. This is where he has to make his stand. The fate of the entire Western Empire is going to be decided right here, right now. Aetius is racing to the city, but his army, it's this fragile, complicated coalition that he has painstakingly put together. He's got his Roman troops, yeah, but the real muscle is coming from his former enemies, the Visigoths, led by their king, Theodoric. Now get this. On the other side, Attila's leading his Huns, and they're supported by people they'd conquered, including the Ostrogoths, who were cousins of the very same Visigoths fighting for Rome. This wasn't just a battle, it was like a civil war of nations. The two armies finally met on the Catalonian plains, and the battle that followed was just chaos on an unimaginable scale. As one Gothic warrior who was actually there described it, it was a slaughter unlike anything the world had ever seen before. In the middle of it all, the Visigoth king Theodoric was killed, trampled to death under the feet of his own charging cavalry. Now, you always have to be a little skeptical with numbers from this period, but the accounts from the time claim a staggering 162,000 men died in one single day. Just unbelievable carnage. In the end, though, it was Aetius's brilliant generalship, combined with the absolute fury of the Visigoth avenging their king, that carried the day. Attila was defeated, he was forced to retreat back across the Rhine, and this was the first major blow to his reputation of being invincible. But Attila wasn't destroyed, not by a long shot. A year later, he was back, and this time he was invading Italy itself. But his ultimate end, it wouldn't come from a sword on the battlefield. It would come from something way more mundane. So, after sacking several cities in Italy, Attila marched towards Rome. And then he just stopped. Why? Well, it was probably a mix of things. His army was weak from disease and looting, a massive ransom was paid by the Pope, and you can't discount superstition. He was warned that Alaric, another conqueror, had died right after sacking the Eternal City. So, he turned back. And then, in the year 453, the story of this great conqueror ends with a bizarre, almost comical twist of fate. He was celebrating his latest marriage to a new bride named Ildico, and he drank himself into a complete stupor. During the night, an artery in his throat burst, and he literally suffocated on his own blood. The scourge of God was gone, and his vast empire, which was held together only by his sheer force of will, almost immediately started to crumble as his sons fought over the pieces. So, with the Hunnic threat just dissolved, the Roman Empire should have been able to breathe a huge sigh of relief, right? It had been saved. But this is where the story turns from this epic of survival into a deep, dark tragedy. Rome, now free from its greatest external enemy, immediately turned on itself. Remember Emperor Valentinian, the weak, jealous ruler? He had relied on Aetius for his very survival, but he also hated him for it. And now, with Attila dead, Aetius's power, his fame, his army of loyal followers, well, that no longer looked like a shield for the empire. To the emperor, it looked like a dagger aimed right at his own throne. The collapse came with terrifying speed. In 454, just 1 year after Attila's death, Valentinian calls Aetius to the palace. As the general is literally giving a financial report, the emperor suddenly pulls out his sword, the first time he'd ever drawn it, and plunges it right into Aetius's chest. His courtiers then join in, stabbing the defenseless general over and over. But it doesn't end there. Less than a year later, Valentinian himself is cut down in public by 2 of Aetius's loyal guards, getting revenge for their murdered leader. After murdering Aetius, the emperor actually asked a Roman nobleman if he thought it was a good idea. And that nobleman's reply is one of the most damning and prophetic assessments in all of history. In a fit of paranoid jealousy, Valentinian hadn't just killed a rival. He had destroyed the one man capable of defending Rome. He had, as the man said, amputated the empire's own sword arm. And that just leaves us with this one final, haunting question. Was the fall of Rome really inevitable because of outside forces like Attila, or was the real poison already inside the system? The story of Valentinian and Aetius seems to suggest that even if Rome had somehow defeated all of its enemies, it might have just found a way to destroy itself anyway. The decay, it really seems, was coming from within.